It did not begin with a speech. It began with a list 5 demands from Washington, dropped into the review of the trade agreement that still holds most of North America's economic architecture. Together, dairy, digital, media, provincial procurement, provincial alcohol restrictions, the kind of list that is usually handled in private, where pressure is applied quietly and the weaker side is expected to yield 1 point at a time. But this time, the list landed in public, and within 24 hours, Mark Carney's answer was effectively no to all 5, not a partial yes, not a symbolic concession, not the usual diplomatic language that lets everyone pretend there is still lots of room to bargain, just a refusal. That was the real moment, because the real story is not that Trump's team made demands. Washington has always used pressure inside North American trade politics. The real story is that when those demands finally arrived, they hit a Canadian system that had already been reinforced in advance. That is what changes everything. What looked like a negotiation was really an exposure test. And the exposure test revealed something Washington did not want revealed. Many of the sectors that tried to pressure are sectors Ottawa had already begun turning from bargaining chips into structural positions. That is the whole argument. The headline says Canada rejected 5 demands. The deeper story is that America discovered how much of its trade leverage was already colliding with Canadian hardening and American self-constraint at the same time. Once you see that, the entire episode stops looking like ordinary brinkmanship. Start with the deepest layer, energy. Washington did not put energy first in the public sequence, but energy sits underneath everything else. The United States imports roughly 3.8 million barrels of crude oil per diem from Canada. That is about 23% of total U.S. refinery feedstock. And the key point is not just the volume, it is the chemistry. Gulf Coast refineries are built around Canadian heavy sour crude. That means the dependence is physical, not rhetorical. It is baked into industrial equipment and refinery design. And it is not only oil. During winter peaks, New England leans on Canadian electricity imports to help keep homes heated and grids stable. That means the energy relationship is not a favor. It is a structural necessity. And that one fact changes the entire negotiation atmosphere. Because once one side knows, the other side cannot easily rewire a dependence of that size. Every other threat begins to lose some of its totality. Pressure still exists, but total pressure becomes less believable. And once total pressure becomes less believable, fear starts leaking out of the room. That is the first shift. Now move to dairy. From the American side, the complaint is easy to state. Canada's supply management system is protectionist, imports above quota-based tariffs that can exceed 200% and in some categories approach 298%. Presented abstractly, that sounds outrageous, but that is not how Canada sees it. Inside Canada, supply management is not just a tariff wall. It is a domestic stabilization system. It protects politically important farming communities, especially in Quebec, and keeps a highly sensitive agricultural sector from being thrown into the price logic of a much larger continental market. And the critical change this time is not rhetorical defense. It is legal hardening. Canada has already moved to protect supply management legislatively. That matters enormously because once a point of pressure is embedded in law, it changes category. What used to be a negotiable chip becomes a structural line. Even if Ottawa wanted to yield, it would first have to reopen the legal and political space for yielding. In other words, the state has made concession more expensive than before. That is not a normal bargaining environment. Now, go to digital media because this is where trade pressure turns into a sovereignty fight. Washington sees Canada's online streaming and online news laws as discriminatory burdens on American firms like Netflix, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. Ottawa sees the same laws very differently. It sees them as a way to defend cultural survival in a country sitting directly beside the largest media machine on earth. That is not a minor distinction for Washington. This is a revenue and market access issue. For Ottawa, it is a control issue. Who gets the money? Who gets the audience? Who gets to shape the content pipeline? Who gets to decide whether a smaller state retains a national cultural space or simply gets absorbed by the scale of its neighbor? Once a dispute reaches that level, it is no longer just about trade fairness. It becomes a question of statehood expressed through regulation. That is why Canada hardened there too. Now take procurement. The American position sounds straightforward. U.S. firms want greater access to provincial procurement in places like Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. But this argument weakens the second you hold it next to America. S-own behavior. Buy American is not a slogan. It is a system, federal contracts, infrastructure spending, defense spending, domestic sourcing rules The United States protects its own industrial base through procurement all the time. So for Canada to loosen domestic preference, while the U.S. keeps its own, would not read in Ottawa as fair reciprocity. It would read as asymmetry dressed up as liberalization. That is why this demand was never as strong as it sounded. Then comes alcohol, which looks small until you notice the sequence. Several Canadian provinces restricted American beer and wine only after U.S. tariffs were imposed on Canadian goods. That means Canada's move was retaliatory, not initiating. So when Washington asks Canada to lift those restrictions while its own tariffs remain, it is not really negotiating. It is asking Ottawa to stop responding while the original pressure continues. That is not a trade-off, that is compliance. And Ottawa clearly read it that way. Now notice what was conspicuously not pushed hardest autos. That silence is one of the most revealing facts in the entire story, because everybody involved understands that the North American auto sector is not just a trade lane. It is one industrial organism, parts cross the border multiple times before final assembly. Plants in Canada produce components for American vehicles. U.S. plants supply engines and parts for Canadian production. Tens of billions of dollars in value come from this system functioning as one integrated machine. Washington was careful there because it had to be. Pushed too hard on autos and you destabilize your own manufacturers almost immediately. That is why the auto sector stayed near the edge of the visible demand structure. Not because it is unimportant, but because it is too important. And once you map the package properly, the pattern becomes impossible to miss. Each demand was supposed to expose Canadian vulnerability. Instead, each one exposed American limits. Dairy ran into law, digital media ran into sovereignty, procurement ran into hypocrisy, alcohol ran into sequencing, autos ran into integration, and all of it sat underneath energy, where dependence runs south as much as north. That is why the list failed to produce what Washington expected. Now add the most important layer. Canada was not only refusing inward, it had already begun building outward. For decades, nearly 3/4 of Canadian exports went to the United States. That concentration created the old politics of caution. It trained governments to believe access came before everything else, but that is the older Canadian model. The newer one is more diversified agricultural openings toward China, more active positioning toward Europe. Domestic procurement steering roughly $70 billion toward Canadian suppliers. Stronger federal. Provincial coordination around strategic manufacturing, critical minerals being treated not merely as exports, but as future leverage in clean energy and artificial intelligence supply chains. These moves do not replace the U.S. market. They do not need to. They only need to reduce panic. They only need to move Canada from pure dependence to managed exposure. That is the real structural shift. And once that shift becomes visible, Carney's rejection stops looking like emotional defiance. It starts looking like prepared refusal. That is why the Davos speech mattered too. When Carney said that countries not seated at the table end up on the menu, the line landed because it translated a trade review into a larger geopolitical warning. Middle powers that fail to build sovereignty eventually become objects inside someone else's bargaining system. Washington could dismiss that as virtue signaling, but a lot of the world heard something else. They heard Canada beginning to speak less like a dependent neighbor and more like a state trying to become structurally harder to squeeze. Now, look back at Washington because the contradiction there is one of the most revealing parts of all this. Trump talks publicly as if the agreement may not matter, but his own trade representative lays out detailed conditions for preserving it. Greer's congressional testimony cites roughly $960 billion in U.S. exports under the agreement and major growth since implementation. American industry groups from autos to energy to agriculture urge continuation. Those things do not line up with a story of irrelevance. They line up with a story of deep importance. And that is why the pressure is so revealing. No administration invests this much pressure in an agreement it can walk away from cleanly. The more Washington pushes, the more clearly it reveals what is at stake in its own system. That is the inversion at the center of this moment. Pressure was supposed to display dominance. Instead, it disclosed dependence. And once the supposedly weaker side sees where the stronger side cannot escalate cleanly, the bargaining atmosphere changes from fear to calculation. That is where North America now stands, moving toward July with 3 visible paths ahead: a full extension, a withdrawal, or annual reviews, stretching uncertainty year by year. That third option will be sold as moderation. It is not moderation. It is corrosion. Long-term uncertainty poisons investment in sectors that require long planning horizons: autos, energy, manufacturing, critical minerals, infrastructure. If uncertainty becomes the operating condition, capital starts hedging away from the very system the agreement was built to stabilize. And here is the irony at the center of all of this. If Washington keeps using pressure this way, it may accelerate exactly the diversification it says it wants to prevent. Every unresolved demand gives Ottawa more reason to widen alternatives. Every review cycle rewards preparation over accommodation. Every threat strengthens the argument inside Canada that flexibility is now safer than dependence. That is the real shift. This is not just about 5 demands. It is about whether North America remains organized around automatic American fear leverage or begins drifting toward a looser, harder, more sovereignty-driven model. That is what changes everything, not the list alone, not even the rejection alone. The fact that the rejection may have revealed more clearly than anyone in Washington intended that fear no longer works as cleanly as it used to.